The wind drifted softly across the valley that evening, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke and the faint cry of crows as they circled above the barren fields. The earth was tired. The soil, cracked and weary, yielded little grain for the season. A lone man moved slowly across the path, his steps heavy, his shoulders bent, his arms straining beneath the weight of firewood stacked high against his chest. His clothes were worn thin, patched and frayed at the seams, and his boots sank into the dust as though the earth itself wished to pull him down. This man was Thomas, a father who bore burdens greater than the wood upon his back. The cottage he returned to was small, half hidden by weeds, its roof patched with straw and its windows dim with soot. Yet to him, it was not just shelter. It was the last refuge of memory, the only place left where the laughter of his late wife still seemed to linger. 3 winters had passed since she was lowered into the cold earth. 3 winters since the light of his home had been stolen away, leaving only him and a boy too young to understand why his mother's voice no longer called from the kitchen door. Thomas laid the bundle of wood beside the hearth, his breath ragged, his body trembling from a day of labor that earned him little more than a crust of bread. His hands, rough with calluses, trembled as he lit the fire. The sparks rose, catching the dry kindling, and for a moment the room was bathed in a glow warmer than the air outside. And in that light a boy stirred. Peter, no more than 7 years of age, blinked sleepily from the corner where he had curled upon a straw mattress. His eyes, wide and bright, like the clear sky after a storm, looked up at his father with quiet trust. He did not see the worry etched into Thomas's face. He did not see the weight that pressed upon his father's chest each time he counted the coins left in the tin box. Each time he wondered how long they could stretch a loaf, how long before hunger came knocking at their door. The boy yawned and reached out, and Thomas, though weary, sat beside him. He gathered the child into his arms, holding him as though he were the last precious thing upon the earth. The fire crackled, and Thomas began to tell a story, a tale of knights and hidden kingdoms, of battles fought and victories won. His voice was soft, steady, as though the words themselves could shield his son from the harshness of their reality. And Peter, with the trust only a child could carry, closed his eyes and let those words carry him into sleep. But when the boy's breathing slowed, Thomas's voice fell silent. He stared into the flames, and in their shifting shapes he saw his fears made real. The hollow eyes of hunger, the cold shadow of debt, the faces of neighbors who pitied him, who whispered behind his back. He was a man bound not only by poverty, but by shame, for though he labored with all his strength, the world gave him little in return. The night deepened, and still he sat there, one hand resting on his son's small shoulder, the other clenched against his knee. He prayed, though his words were more sigh than speech, asking for strength, for mercy, for a way forward. And as the fire dwindled and the cottage sank into silence, Thomas felt the weight of an unseen storm approaching. Somewhere beyond the hills, in the great manor that overlooked the valley, a widow of wealth and cunning had already taken note of him. And soon her offer would come, a proposal so shocking it would test every part of his soul and force him to choose between hunger and honor, between the temptation of riches and the promise he had once made to the woman he loved. Upon the hill, far above the fields where men bent their backs in toil, stood Harrington Manor. Its stone walls rose against the horizon like a fortress. Its windows glimmered with the last rays of the setting sun, and its gates, heavy with iron, seemed designed not merely to keep intruders out, but to remind every passerby of the gulf between wealth and want. To those who lived in the valley, it was a place of whispers, a house filled with mystery, grandeur, and the shadow of a woman both feared and admired. Lady Eleanor Harrington had outlived her husband by more than a decade, yet her presence in the land was as commanding as ever. She was known for her sharp wit and her sharper tongue, for her generosity when it suited her and her cruelty when she was displeased. Some said she gave bread to the poor, though always in a manner that left them indebted to her favor. Others said she held secrets, that behind her painted smile and dark gowns lay a hunger greater than gold could satisfy. Men spoke of her in hushed tones, women eyed her with suspicion, yet none dared defy her. For she held the deeds to more land than any noble within 3 counties, and her influence spread like roots beneath the soil. When a messenger came to Thomas's cottage bearing her seal, the farmer's heart sank with dread. The parchment carried no explanation, only a summons. He was to present himself at Harrington Manor before the week's end. A poor man does not refuse such a call, for to decline was to invite ruin. And so, on the appointed day, Thomas dressed in the plainest garments he owned, clothes that, though clean, bore the mark of hard labor, and made the long walk up the winding road that led to her gates. The air grew colder as he approached. The gravel crunched beneath his boots, and the crows, black as shadows, perched upon the stone walls as if they too were sentinels of the house. When the gates swung open, he was ushered in by servants whose eyes barely glanced his way, as though he were invisible, a mere peasant unworthy of notice. Yet to Thomas, each step through the manicured gardens and towering arches of the manor filled him with unease. He had lived his life among tilled fields and weather-worn cottages. Such splendor seemed unnatural, almost oppressive. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood, of burning incense, of perfumes meant to disguise the weight of time. The great hall stretched before him, its marble floors gleaming, its chandeliers heavy with candles that cast a golden glow upon the portraits lining the walls. Faces of Harrington ancestors gazed down from their gilded frames, stern men and proud women, eyes fixed as though judging him for daring to stand in their presence. And then she appeared. Lady Eleanor descended the grand staircase with a grace that belied her years. She wore a gown of deep crimson, the fabric rich and flowing, embroidered with threads that caught the light like fire. Her dark hair was bound in pearls, and around her neck hung jewels that shimmered with the weight of old wealth. It was not her attire that held Thomas still, it was her gaze. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, fixed upon him as though she could see not only the dirt beneath his nails, but the secrets of his soul. "Thomas of the Valley," she said, her voice smooth, each word measured as though weighed upon a scale. "I have heard of you. A man of toil, a man of persistence, a man whose life has been burdened with loss." Her words struck deep, for though they were delivered without cruelty, they carried no kindness either. They were facts laid bare, reminders of wounds Thomas tried each day to hide. He bowed his head, his voice steady though low. "I do what I must, my lady. My son depends on it." At the mention of his boy, something flickered across Eleanor's face, an expression too quick to be named. Then her lips curved into a smile that seemed at once inviting and dangerous, like a candle's flame that promises warmth yet can consume all it touches. "You are a man who works, yet still you struggle," she continued, stepping closer, her gown sweeping across the marble. "You scrape by on barren land, you carry debt upon your shoulders, and still the world denies you rest. Your boy deserves more than this, does he not? He deserves not hunger, but abundance. Not rags, but dignity." Thomas said nothing. The truth of her words weighed upon him, yet the manner in which she spoke made his chest tighten. For in her voice was not pity, but calculation, as though she were measuring the worth of the man before her, deciding whether he might be bent to her will. Finally, Eleanor stopped before him. She reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his sleeve, a gesture so unexpected that Thomas stiffened. Her eyes locked with his, unyielding, relentless. And then she spoke the words that would echo in his mind long after he left that hall. "I could end your suffering with a single command. I could grant you land enough to build a legacy, wealth enough to silence every whisper against you. 500 acres, Thomas. 500 acres of fertile earth, yours to claim. But such gifts do not come without a price. And the price I ask of you is simple: one night. One night beneath my roof, in my chamber as mine." Her voice lingered on the final word, a low murmur that sent a chill down his spine. The hall grew still. The candles flickered. The painted eyes of her ancestors seemed to watch more intently, and Thomas felt the floor beneath him sway. He had expected work, perhaps an errand, perhaps a debt to be repaid. But this was no offer of labor. This was a test, a temptation clothed in velvet and whispered with the weight of wealth. Lady Eleanor's gaze did not falter. She stood poised, her expression unreadable save for the faint curve of her lips, as though she already knew which choice he would make. And in that moment, Thomas understood. He had stepped not merely into a manor of stone, but into a snare woven of power and desire, and the decision he would make here could shape the fate of his son forever. The chamber seemed to close in on him, though it stretched wide with pillars of marble and velvet curtains that reached toward the ceiling like banners of a kingdom. Thomas stood rooted to the floor, his breath caught in his chest, while the echo of her words burned through his mind. 500 acres. A fortune greater than any dream he had dared allow himself. For a single night. Lady Eleanor's eyes glimmered as she watched him wrestle with silence. She leaned back in her high-backed chair, fingers drumming lightly upon the polished armrest, her composure calm, her expression almost amused. "You are shocked," she said at last, her tone smooth as silk. "But think of what I offer. Land as far as your eye can see, rich and fertile, yours by dawn. No more begging bread. No more debts pressing against your door. A life of ease for the boy you love." Thomas swallowed hard, his throat dry, his palms damp with sweat. He wanted to look away, but her gaze bound him as tightly as chains. He thought of Peter, barefoot in the cold, his belly never full, his little hands clutching at his father's sleeve, asking for bread. He thought of the creditors who sneered each time he promised payment, knowing it would never be enough. For a moment, temptation surged through him like fire. Yet shame followed quickly behind. The memory of his wife's face rose before him, her eyes gentle, her voice whispering vows once spoken beneath the church roof, that he would protect their child, raise him with dignity, never bow to corruption. Could he betray her memory for a night's gain? Could he sell his honor, even if it meant his son's future? Eleanor leaned forward, her voice lowering, the edges of her smile curling like the corner of a blade. "Do not look so burdened. What is one night, Thomas? A single act forgotten by morning. Men have given more for less. You need only close your eyes and remember why you do it. By sunrise, you shall be master of a kingdom greater than you ever dreamed." Her words wrapped around him like smoke, stinging, suffocating, drawing him closer to the fire she kindled. He could feel the weight of her expectation pressing down, daring him to submit, daring him to trade poverty for plenty. Thomas's heart pounded. His lips parted, but no answer came. At last, with effort, he forced his voice to break the silence. "My lady, I cannot answer you now." The smile upon Eleanor's lips deepened, a soundless laugh shimmering in her eyes. She rose from her chair, the sweep of her gown whispering across the floor, and she circled him like a hawk circling prey. "Then return to me tomorrow," she murmured, her breath close to his ear. "By then, decide whether your son shall inherit hunger or inherit 500 acres. Choose wisely, Thomas of the Valley." And with a wave of her jeweled hand, she dismissed him into the night. He stumbled from the manor's gates, his heart torn between the voice of desperation and the voice of honor, knowing that by the next sunset he must choose between them. The path home seemed longer than ever, and with every step the weight of her offer grew heavier, until it seemed even the earth beneath him might break. The night was long, and the cottage seemed smaller than ever beneath the weight of Thomas's thoughts. The fire burned low, its glow casting restless shadows across the wooden walls, while outside the wind whispered against the shutters like voices urging him one way, then another. He sat at the edge of the table, elbows resting on the scarred wood, his hands pressed hard against his temples as though he could silence the storm inside. Every thought of the land pulled him deeper into temptation. 500 acres, soil rich enough to yield harvests beyond measure, pastures green enough to raise cattle, a legacy that would carry his son into a life of security. He pictured Peter running through fields not of dust, but of wheat tall enough to brush against his shoulders, a boy free from want, a boy respected, no longer scorned as the son of a poor farmer. But then came the other voice, stern and unyielding, the voice of his own conscience. At what cost, Thomas? At what cost will you give your child this life? Shall his future be built upon the ruin of your honor? Shall you sell your soul for land, and stand before him one day as a man who yielded himself for comfort? He clenched his fists. The fire crackled. The wind howled. His chest ached with the pull of two worlds, the one of hunger and shame he already knew, and the one of plenty that glittered before him like a poisoned chalice. From the corner of the room came the sound of stirring. Peter's small form shifted beneath his blanket, his hair falling across his brow, his eyes blinking open with the drowsiness of a child half dreaming. "Father," he whispered, "will we have bread tomorrow?" The word struck Thomas harder than any blow. He turned, and for a moment he could not speak. He saw the hollow cheeks of his son, the fragile hope in his eyes, the trust that had never wavered. A lump rose in his throat, and he forced a smile, though it trembled. "Yes, my boy," he said softly. "There will be bread." Peter closed his eyes again, and within moments his breathing slowed, steady and innocent. Thomas remained there, watching him, his heart heavy yet strangely resolute. The choice he faced was no longer about himself. It was about the kind of man his son would remember. Would Peter grow up seeing a father who had been under temptation, or a father who stood, even when standing meant hunger? By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the window, Thomas had not slept. His eyes were red with weariness, but within them burned a quiet certainty. He knew what he would say when he returned to the manor. He would go not as a beggar crawling for land, but as a man who would demand something greater, something no amount of gold or acres could equal. And though his heart trembled at the thought of facing Lady Eleanor again, Thomas knew this. The battle within him had been fought, and the answer was already written in the silence of the night. The road to Harrington Manor was quiet the following day, yet every step Thomas took seemed to thunder in his ears. The valley lay stretched beneath a pale sky, the morning mist clinging to the hedgerows like ghostly veils. His body was weary, his eyes hollow from a night without rest, but his resolve was firm, each step carrying him closer to the confrontation he could not avoid. The grand gates of the estate opened once more, and the guards, expressionless as stone, led him inside. The manor seemed colder than before, though the fires still burned in the great hall, and the scent of perfume lingered in the air. Thomas felt none of its warmth. He walked beneath the stern gaze of portraits, past marble pillars that gleamed with polish, until at last he came before Lady Eleanor again. She was seated in her gilded chair, as though she had not moved since his last visit, her gown this time black as night, her jewels glittering like drops of frozen rain. Her smile met him before her words. "So, Thomas," she said, her voice rich with satisfaction, "the farmer has returned. Tell me, have you chosen wisely? Have you decided that your son will not inherit misery?" Her confidence pressed upon him, but Thomas stood straighter than he had before, his hands steady at his sides. He bowed his head briefly in respect, then raised his eyes to meet hers without faltering. "I have chosen, my lady, but not as you expect." The curve of her lips tightened. She leaned forward slightly, studying him with narrowed eyes. "Speak, then. What bargain do you bring me?" Thomas drew a slow breath, his voice low but unwavering. "I do not ask for 500 acres, nor for gold, nor for cattle. I do not wish for titles or comforts. What I ask for is far greater than all these things." A flicker of annoyance crossed her features, though curiosity quickly followed. "Greater? And what would a poor farmer know of things greater than wealth?" He stepped closer, his words carrying a weight that filled the chamber. "Give my son the chance to learn. Grant him books, tutors, a path to knowledge. Let him rise not through inheritance of land, but through the strength of his mind. Teach him to grow beyond the soil I till, beyond the poverty that binds us. That is what I ask, my lady, not land for myself, but a future for him." The hall grew silent. The air itself seemed to pause. Lady Eleanor's eyes widened, her composure shaken for the first time. She had expected greed, desperation, perhaps even tears, but not this. Never this. "You refuse my land?" she whispered, disbelief trembling in her voice. "You reject 500 acres to beg instead for the boy's schooling?" Thomas bowed his head once more, though his voice remained firm. "Yes, my lady. For what worth is land if my son grows without wisdom? What use is gold if he inherits only hunger of the mind? Give him knowledge, and you will have given me more than fields or cattle could ever provide." Eleanor rose from her chair, her gown sweeping like a storm across the floor as she drew nearer. She stopped but a step away, her breath unsteady, her eyes searching his face as though seeking some flaw, some weakness. Yet all she found was conviction, plain and unshaken. And in that moment, the manor's mistress, who had commanded the wills of many men, found herself struck not with triumph but with astonishment. For here stood a farmer who would not be bought, who valued not his own hunger but his son's tomorrow, and in his refusal he spoke a truth she had long buried within herself. For a long while, Lady Eleanor said nothing. The hall, once so proud with its chandeliers and polished stone, seemed to grow smaller as silence pressed in on every corner. She stared at Thomas as if she no longer knew what manner of man stood before her. The farmer's words hung in the air, heavy and immovable, defying every expectation she had laid upon him. At last she turned, her steps slow, her hand brushing against the carved edge of her chair as though she needed its support. She walked toward the tall windows, where sunlight spilled in pale ribbons across the floor. Her reflection in the glass startled her. It was not the regal lady of wealth and power she saw, but a woman aged by years of loneliness, her eyes sharp with pride, yet shadowed with longing. "You refuse riches," she murmured, her voice low, more to herself than to him. "You refuse land and titles and ease for learning." Her shoulders shook once, a tremor she did not mean to reveal. "For a boy's schooling?" Thomas answered with a calm that seemed to steady even the silence. "Yes, my lady, for that alone. I cannot give myself for gold, but I will give all I am to see my son lifted above me. That is the gift I beg of you." Her fingers tightened upon the window's frame. Memories rose unbidden, striking her like echoes of a long-forgotten storm. She was a child again, standing in the great hall of her father's house, begging to be taught letters while her brothers were led away to their tutors. "Books are not for you," her father had said, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. "A woman's duty is to marry well, not to think." The shame of that denial had burned in her soul, a hunger that never truly died, though she had clawed her way to knowledge after widowhood. Now, standing in the same hall where she had once claimed power over others, she felt the sharp sting of tears rising to her eyes. She turned her face away, unwilling for Thomas to see the weakness breaking through the mask she had worn for years. But the tears fell nonetheless, glistening against her cheek, softening the lines of a face long hardened by pride. "You shame me, Thomas," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "You shame me because you ask not for yourself, but for the boy. And you shame me because I, who hold wealth enough to feed 100 families, never thought to offer what you have asked." For the first time, her tone held no command, no arrogance, only the voice of a woman stripped bare of her defenses. She turned back to him, her eyes wet, her lips trembling though she tried to hold them firm. "Do you know what you have done? You have awakened in me a memory I buried deep, a wound I thought long healed. You remind me of the education I was denied, of the years I was told to silence my mind. And now you stand before me asking that your son be spared the same hunger. You ask, and you stir my soul." The tears fell freely now, not with grief alone, but with a strange release, as though in speaking the truth she had unlocked a door within herself long bolted shut. She sank into her chair once more, no longer the untouchable mistress of Harrington Manor, but a woman confronted by her own heart. And in that moment, as the farmer stood silent, Lady Eleanor wept, not for him, nor for his request, but for the girl she had once been and the life she might have known had someone fought for her as fiercely as this man fought for his son. The days that followed were unlike any Thomas had imagined. Lady Eleanor, once feared for her cunning and admired for her wealth, set her will upon a new task. With her seal, she summoned tutors from the city. Men and women learned in letters, numbers, and histories far beyond the reach of a farmer's son. She opened her vast library, its shelves heavy with tomes that had gathered dust for years, and placed it at the disposal of the boy Peter. And so it was that the child who once lay hungry by the fire now walked the halls of Harrington Manor with books clasped to his chest, his eyes bright with the flame of knowledge. Each day he returned home with stories upon his lips, of kings and kingdoms, of laws and lands, of words that opened doors his father had never known existed. And each evening Thomas listened with quiet pride, his weary heart lifted by the sight of his son growing not in wealth, but in wisdom. The valley spoke of it in whispers at first. The widow had taken the boy under her wing, they said, perhaps to soothe her conscience, perhaps for some secret reason of her own. But as seasons turned and the boy's mind blossomed, the whispers grew into respect. They began to see in Peter not merely the son of a poor farmer, but a youth destined for more than the plow and the spade. Years passed, and the story deepened. Peter grew into a man of learning, his voice strong, his words measured, his heart steady with the same integrity that had guided his father that fateful night. Lady Eleanor herself found a strange redemption in her choice, for in teaching the boy she healed a wound within her own soul. No longer did she rule with pride alone. She was remembered, too, for her gift of education, for planting a seed that would grow long after her wealth had faded. And Thomas, he remained the same humble man, tilling the soil, mending his cottage, yet carrying within him a peace no riches could have purchased. He had chosen honor over land, dignity over temptation, and in so doing had given his son the greatest inheritance of all. So when people told the tale in the years to come, they spoke of it not as the story of a bargain struck between a farmer and a widow, but as the story of a man who would not sell his soul, and of a boy who rose because his father chose rightly. And now, dear listener, if this story touched your heart, if it stirred something within you, as it has within many before, do not forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us where you are listening from, and let these stories find their way into every corner of the world. For tales such as these remind us that true wealth is not found in gold or in acres, but in the choices that shape the legacy we leave behind.